The quality expected from gaming in the 21st century is remarkably high, but considering that you've got the best part of 35 years of experience to tap into, you'd expect that people would be making less mistakes. The bar may be high, but it means that you can tell when someone tries to limbo underneath it.
I think I'll look back on 2015 as the year where game developers tried to get away with stupid shit and people noticed. Actually, in a way, it reminds me a lot of 2014. Old habits die hard, I guess. Of course, not every game ended up like that, as you'll find out next week, but it does get a little tiresome hearing every week that another game has come out unfinished or has been rushed through Steam Greenlight. So let's have a little fun with this one. I'm only going to be allowing games onto this list that originally came out this year. So no re-releases, no ports from a previous year, no remakes, no DLC, and no patches. With the way that modern gaming is going nowadays, where releasing an incomplete game and fixing it later is alarmingly common practice, I think it would be best if I primarily took this into account. And hey, it's nearly Christmas, so don't buy these. I don't do much consumer advice on this channel, but seriously, not even for a joke. Merry Christmas, everybody. There are signs to look out for in anticipation of a bad game, and one of the very best is the review embargo. And not just banning a particular publication from talking about a game, no one can touch it. And it's a shame really, because I was willing to give Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival as much space as it wanted to bring the world of Animal Crossing into a party game setting, but even then, what we got fully justified Nintendo's lack of confidence in it. If you asked any long-time fans of Animal Crossing if they would prefer a full-blown game on the Wii U or a slow party game, then I think we start to get to the bottom of what's wrong with this game. No one asked for this. Somehow, we made it through 2015 with 2 Animal Crossing games released that not many people would have hoped for, but at least Happy Home Designer offered up ideas to take forward for the next main installment. Amiibo Festival is one of the most boring and slow-paced games released this year, where players ironically compete for happy points in a party game devoid of entertainment. Sure, it's got a bit of charm and it's hard to truly hate this game, but it does feel like a half-assed attempt at a stopgap, designed with Amiibo sales at a higher priority than making a quality game. Let's just pray that this is all leading to something better in 2016. You gotta live in hope.
There's 3 ways of getting attention as a video game. You can either be amazing, terrible, or controversial. The video game known as Hatred wanted attention so badly, it chose to be 2 of these. Have a guess which ones?
I imagine there was a point sometime after the first trailer was released that sent suitably triggering shockwaves across the gaming media that developer Destructive Creations remember that they've got to make a game out of all of this. Hatred as a concept is one thing. Video games will always stray a little too close to the line when it comes to simulating violence, but it could be justified if the actual game is good, like Mortal Kombat. And I'm sure you know where this is going. How do you make mass homicide boring? Well, actually it's not that hard. All you need to do is produce your game to be the absolute minimum required to be considered a killing spree simulator. Somewhere between the monochrome design and isometric camera angle, your adventure in manslaughter manages to be as awkward and as mundane as you'd ever think possible. And with a protagonist as one-dimensionally bland as this, with motives that boil down to fuck the world, Hatred just isn't all that interesting. Maybe it stands as a metaphor saying that violence is never the best path, but more than likely it's just a magnet for people to cling to when talking about controversy in gaming. And we've been there multiple times before. Not too long ago it was called Postal, and those games were trash too. You see a trend yet? In 2012, developer Shiver Games released the critically, Lucius, a psychological horror game where you play as a 6-year-old boy with magic devil powers who kills his family in a variety of suitably demonic ways. It's a promising idea, but with an execution this poor, it was always going to struggle to win over critics. But that's okay, 3 years later and we got a sequel with Lucius 2, The Prophecy. And I'm sure in that time they've ironed out the wrinkles that the first game had, and we can experience a horror game as the creepy monster in full flow. Nope, none of that. Are you feeling scared yet? No? Okay, how about now? Still nothing? It's always hard to replicate the fear of a well-done horror game when you're the main threat, but it's even more difficult if you didn't make your game properly. Between all the glitches hides an enemy AI, if you can call them enemies, that is so broken that it's hard to feel the weight of any of your actions when these people react so unusually as standard. I still think there's an interesting premise here that could be great if enough time is given to it, but to see it fall flat on its face so hard is a little saddening. Glitches like these, they must be the work of some devil child. I can't describe how much I wanted to like the Order 1886. Back at the start of the year, I heard all the vitriol being thrown at it regarding its tiny single-player campaign, but other than that, things were looking good. Literally, the game looks absolutely fantastic, and you can't underestimate the amount of effort that must have gone into this. But sadly, all those phrases about beauty being only skin deep and plastering beauty products on pigs were wheeled out soon after when people realised that this game was super duper generic. If you ever wanted an example of seeing just how insipid you can make a third-person shooter, then the Order 1886 is the turgid specimen that all developers can look to if they want to put aesthetics over more important things like story or gameplay, or replay value, or player interaction. The length of the campaign wouldn't be an issue if it was a non-stop thrill ride with multiple engaging set pieces, but instead you walk around and shoot some people at 30 frames per second in an awkward widescreen aspect ratio, and you just wonder where all the future of video game stuff is. It's such a shallow experience, and yet it doesn't feel unfinished. It's like serving up a plain omelette and proclaiming it the future of culinary expression.
The good news is that gaming journalists weren't fooled by this. Sure, the initial reaction was to criticise the length, but the Order 1886 didn't get the feedback or the scores that I'm sure the developers must have anticipated. Maybe graphics over gameplay is starting to wear a little thin.
It might not be the same as a review embargo, but when you see two versions of a game get cancelled, leaving Devil's Third as a Wii U exclusive, I would say that is enough material to raise a few eyebrows. Never mind that it's not an exclusive in the same way that Bayonetta 2 was. It's almost like Nintendo didn't get the same memo that Sony and Microsoft got. In fact, it seemed like Japan didn't even get the same game as was released in Europe and America. Devil's Third does not deserve 33 out of 40. Famitsu, get your shit together. There's a nice attempt here to combine hack and slash combat with gunplay, which might have been nice if it had been fleshed out more, but it ends up feeling like the most basic of both worlds. The combat is acting like it's flashy, but nothing has a punch to it, and so there is no payoff. It doesn't feel like you really did anything remarkable to get to a point where you can separate a man's head from the rest of him. And that's ignoring some slightly bigger issues like the early PS3 era graphics, or a main character who looks like if Vin Diesel watched a Japanese remake of Memento. I imagine that the multiple changes to the game's engine didn't help, but it really does feel like a game that came out a few years ago. Actually, no, scratch that. Mad World came out in 2009 and that game's loads better. And it's a lot cheaper. Go play Mad World instead. The Order 1886 might have been dull, but at least it functioned. Devil's Third might have been very mediocre, but at least it had some promise. Hot Lead is the latest in the oh wow, it's so long, line of games squeezed through Steam Greenlight due to some kind of interest shown in it, and then dumped onto Steam without adding much to the game's raw framework. Have I mentioned that it's another cookie-cutter third-person shooter yet? That doesn't help much either.
Steam Greenlight has the potential to be a really great thing, but if the first release of your game is a bug-ridden mess, then you'll lose momentum and it's very hard to get that back. You can release a patch and bug fixes later down the line, but at that point people have moved on to the next aspiring indie game. It's a vicious cycle.
Maybe a year or two down the line, Hot Lead might be able to make something of itself, but as it is now, stay far away, you won't be missing out on anything. There's some comedy value to this, including some beautifully fractured grammar and spelling, but you can just search YouTube for that instead of paying money. If you have way too much moolah, then the game you get has a walk cycle that looks like this, combat that looks like this, and of course, your standard quota of bugs and glitches. Sometimes people say that Steam Greenlight doesn't have any quality control, and games like this go some way towards reaffirming that notion. People shouldn't be paying money for this. A fall from grace can only be more painful the greater the distance you fall from. If you manage to do some tricks on the way down, it can at least give any onlookers some kind of entertainment before you become better acquainted with the concrete waiting for you below. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 5 didn't just fall over, this is a triple front flip into a faceplant with your mangled body frantically glitching through the floor. The story goes that Activision rushed this game out, and I really mean rushed, so that they could have one last product with the name Tony Hawk on it before their license agreement ran out. Does it matter if it's any good or not? Nah, these games have a reputation. I think we've got to a stage where we can afford not to try anymore. You'd need some potent nostalgia to get anything out of this game. Personally, I haven't played any other Tony Hawk games, so I can't judge too much on that, but I'll take a wild stab in the dark and say that the previous games had a better sense of control than this. In a game series where stringing moves together and racking up points is quite a big deal, I'd like to feel like I'm in control of where I'm going. But even if you had an operational steering wheel, Tony Hawk 5's truly broken physics engine will fling you around corners and see you gain and lose momentum with zero consistency. And when you factor in some pretty appalling graphics and the constant and ironic product placement, this really does feel like making a game via the path of least resistance. Maybe if I was a long-time fan I'd be more hurt by this, but as it is, all I see is a chronically fragmented game. At least the glitches are funny.
Here's something you don't see too often. A game so bad that it actually was taken down from all online stores. Not like with Batman Arkham Knight where a shitty port was taken down because it was poorly optimized. A game that did so badly that the publishers chose to back off and refund customers. That was the case with Afro Samurai 2.
This sounds very dramatic, but I kinda like this. Throughout history there's been rotten games made and released that haven't gone down particularly well, but that's often where the story ends, with people trying in vain to get their money back. But with Afro Samurai 2, Publishers vs. Evil had enough awareness of what was going on, and it must be said, respect for the people who spent their money on this game, to not only refund the purchase, but also to cancel 2 extra episodes to the game that were planned to follow. It's not too often that you can praise a publisher for doing the right thing. Just thought I'd talk about that before I lay into this absolute atrocity of a video game. Oh my! Devil's Third, I take it all back, you're a beautiful game with a beautiful engine. I suppose you never really learn to appreciate mediocrity until you see what's far worse than average. Afro Samurai 2 hurts me in many different places. You can look at every small part of this game and find something not working as intended or implemented without a sense of overall perspective. How can you have a hack and slash game with one attack button and enemies that just stand there? How can you have a game that's supposed to be fast paced have massive frame drops whenever you pull off some moves? Then we've got sound design that cranks up the music during cutscenes to drown out key bits of dialogue, and only a few looping tracks for the whole game. It borders on obnoxious at points. Not sure if this series is salvageable at this stage, but at least the people in charge know they've got a problem here. Knowing is half the battle. Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Wasn't that bad. Or so I've heard, I didn't play it, I couldn't care less. The last AC game I gave 2 shits about was Black Flag, and that feels more and more like a very long time ago. Not just because of where Assassin's Creed has gone since, but also when you see a game try and rip it off. Enter Ravenscry. Oh god. A lot of the games on here that I've already talked about could be considered boring or lacking enough features to make it worth your money. Ravenscry wishes it could be considered boring. It stares longingly at hatred and the Order 1886 and prays for a day when that kind of status is possible. As it is, it's an experience plagued by game-breaking and occasionally game-ruining bugs, horrendously stilted gameplay, and a story riddled with atrocious voice acting. The lucky ones were kicked out by the game crashing, but frankly, when you've spent $50 on this, no one is a winner. Developers Reality Pump have since re-released Ravenscry and, finished it, under the new name Vendetta Curse of Ravenscry, which is apparently better, but apart from the fact that I can't take that into account due to the rules I outlined at the start, I'm hardly going to yield ground considering that Reality Pump were okay with putting an unfinished game on Steam for full price. There's bad practice and then there's disrespecting the consumer. Ambitious, but absolutely awful in virtually every way. To a certain extent, you should always respect your elders, as most of the time, these are the people who laid the groundwork that allowed the marvels of today to be possible. For every Call of Duty and Halo, there was Doom and Wolfenstein 3D. For every Super Mario 64, there was the French-made Alpha Waves. And for every Resident Evil and Silent Hill, there was Alone in the Dark. Sure, it had a few hiccups, but the pioneers are rarely without a few flaws. What's important is that future games refine the formula into what it is now, and move that genre of gaming into a more palatable setting, for better or for worse. And in Alone in the Dark's attempts to keep up, we got Alone in the Dark Illumination, one of the most ugly and disastrous games released not only in 2015, but of all time. I think what I'm trying to say here is it's not a good game, it's pretty bad. This is Alone in the Dark's third reboot since its inception in 1992, and I think at some point you've just got to pull the plug. At this stage, the wheel's still spinning, but the hamster has now met a tragic end. Death by half-baked Left 4 Dead meets less scary Resident Evil games ripoff. Which would be fine if it just straight up copied what is considered the norm for survival horror nowadays, but rather remarkably, it manages to get practically everything wrong. After Haunted House was revived last year, another Atari-owned franchise that people stopped caring about, and was also abysmal, you start to see a pattern. It almost smacks of Activision's treatment of Tony Hawk. Vomit out an awful game under a famous name to fool longtime fans into accidentally throwing money at it. It's neither scary nor entertaining, and yet it has the gall to try and be a co-op shooter that also has a barely functioning single-player campaign. I think the term is shoehorned. If we're lucky, history will forget Alone in the Dark Illumination, but Atari will surely strike again. What could be next? Not Roller Coaster Tycoon, please, not that. Anything but that.
This has been RabbidLuigi, and the really irritating part about Alone in the Dark Illumination is that the design of the game completely undermines the game's title. The illumination bit completely negates the dark, and the sole existence of the multiplayer does kind of ruin any notion of being alone. The game hasn't got an identity, it hasn't got an original thought, and if you invited anyone to play multiplayer with you, you don't deserve Christmas.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. Had a bit of a weird stance for this video because I want to point out flaws, but I also didn't want to be too harsh, or rather, unnecessarily harsh. Something about it being nearly Christmas and keeping everything reasonably festive. But hey, maybe I've helped somebody somewhere with their shopping. Anyway, have a very Merry Christmas, and I'll see you next week actually. I've still got to decide on a Game of the Year.